Yes.
Hi, I wanted to ask you about prairie soils and land use.
Yes.
A lot of people I know out in the county are pretty freaked out about a proposed prairie soil map that's going around. A lot of people worried about their land use, worried about whether they're going to be able to use their property to build their shop, you know, something as simple as, you know, putting in a parking lot for their home-based business. I was just wondering, and the thing that really freaks a lot of people out that I've talked to is that this prairie soil zone just happens to soak up all of the urban growth boundary for Lacey, for Tumwater, for Yelm, almost all of it for Olympia. And what I'm mainly wondering is was that data generated with a computer model?
Good question. You're talking about the ordinance we recently passed, interim ordinance that I was saying we're having the public hearing on in mid-September, so I hope you'll come to that. And I believe the answer to your question is yes. I have not, at the public hearing, we will hear from our staff how that soils map was generated. And I believe the answer to your question will prove to be yes. And the point of the ordinance, of course, was to review what we have left of our last remaining prairies. All of it, 3% of the formerly vast prairie lands of South Thurston County are now gone. And so we've got this very small amount left. And so our thinking in passing the interim ordinance was to strengthen protections for the last remaining prairie lands. It doesn't mean that development in these areas cannot take place. It means that on a case-by-case basis, if your land that you own is affected by this ordinance, should it become permanent, it means that you must first be evaluated, again, case by case, by county staff. And if county staff determine that the primary land area you own is indeed prairie land, then you'll be tasked with having to develop a habitat management plan which shows how, with your proposed development, you intend to protect. So, I mean, this is a new thing for us. We'll be very interested to hear what people have to say to us about this ordinance at our public hearing in mid-September, and we'll see where we go from there. I certainly hope that we'll be able to do something about protecting the last remaining prairie lands we have.
Yeah, just one more quick thing I wanted to throw out there. You know, my grandpa's an Nisqually Indian, and in the term of his life, you know, he remembered the time when the natives used to set fire to the prairie to keep the prairie manageable, to manage that habitat. And then at some point, government at some level decided to plant trees. A lot of the area that's in that prairie soil zone map is now forested because, you know, pioneers, Weyerhaeuser, whoever, now have planted trees there. So, I mean, it seems to me like we use government on one end to stop growth with the trees, and now that there's no more prairie, it seems that now we're going to use the prairie as the excuse now.
Well, that's an interesting point you make. As you know, we've been doing prairie burns over the last couple of weeks, and we were supposed to do one this week that, because of weather conditions, and because many of the staff who would have officiated over the burn to be sure it didn't get out of hand were called to work on other things, so that prairie burn has been put off. But one of the things that I learned about prairies that I thought was so interesting, and I'd never thought of this, we did a tour, the commissioners did a tour of the Maytown property, which is largely prairie, and learned that not only are prairies very vulnerable to non-native invasive species, particularly Scotsbroom, but it's also a big, prairie doesn't just stay there and be a prairie. Another invasive species in prairies are beloved evergreens. And so if you want a prairie to stay a prairie, you literally have to go weed out the evergreens because the forest will take over and the prairie is gone. And I'd never known that or thought about that or understood that before I actually went out on a prairie and sort of had the wildlife biologist and the ecologist explain the prairie function to us. So it's been very interesting learning about prairies and their value. The quandary we have about prairies, you probably know this, I didn't realize that you're Nisqually Indian, but the quandary we have about prairies is a very interesting one. Prairies were formed by the retreat of the glaciers, which, you know, is a big mixing action, leaves a bunch of gravel and thin soils and then prairie grasses and habitat. And so you want your gravel lines, all the gravel is underneath the prairies. So one of the threats to prairies is mining for gravel on them. And so it's a quandary because you need gravel, but you're trying to protect the prairies. And so these are the balancing acts that government has to figure out. And we haven't always gotten that right, as your story illustrates.